Greetings, students. Welcome to lecture. I hope this is lecture 6, and I'll be discussing the concepts relating to approaches on educational planning. Definitely, there are at least 5 approaches to educational planning. In other words, talk about approaches. These are several ways through which planners can adopt to planning in educational provision, and mostly, as I've said, that we have at least 5 approaches to educational planning. One is human resource development approach. Second is social demand approach. Third is manpower requirement approach. The fourth one is cost benefit and rate of return analysis, and this fifth one is cost effective and our approach to planning. These two block, which also complies at least 3 of them. If you unpack, you have CB, you have RA, and you have CEA. And the others also we have cost utility analysis. They fall under the so-called, they fall under economics. And if you study more about economics of education, you're going to understand more of these applied techniques of deciding how you should plan in educational process. So sometimes some other version will present 4 of them. That will be 1, 2, the human, social, manpower, and then you'll have cost analysis, which within you are going to study cost benefit, rate of return, and cost effective analysis. Now, for the sake of this class, I've tried to unpack the economic technique approach to educational planning into 2 parts: the cost benefit and cost rate of return, and then also cost effective approach. And by starting with the so-called social demand approach to educational planning. So demand approach to educational planning, in my own term, and I have given it a name as this one is the so-called devil. It's the devil behind unemployed educated, or educated unemployed. I have given this name because it's mostly applied in developing countries, and mostly in Tanzania, because it's very appealing to politicians, very appealing to build egalitarian society, and therefore it's more common than others, which we're going to discuss in this class. What is this? Social demand approach and educational planning is a method in educational planning which assume or take education as a public social services. In such a way, it's a necessity and an inalienable right to all citizens who desires. This term, inalienable, means that it does not exclude, no exclusion of any person. No one is left behind, because it regarded as education as a human right, and most of our countries are subscriber to the so-called human rights bill, or the international human rights, which asserts that all human beings have right to education. And that's why most of the countries, they are trying to provide education as more as possible, at least to some set degree. They have defined the basic level, which at least all citizens should acquire that level of education. For example, in Tanzania, under the current education and training policy of 2014, version 2023, we are now implementing the so-called compulsory basic education for all. Compulsory basic education for all, which starts from pre-primary to lower secondary education. Mean from pre-primary to all level, you have to undergo this level of education, and this is compulsory basic to all Tanzanian. So this try to explain or to define this human right declaration on providing education. And education sustainable development goals, goal number 4, sustainable development goals number 4, it stipulates that all countries must strive to provide quality education for all. We are no longer advocating education for all, but a quality education for all. So an choice demand approach, education is regarded as a human right, at least to the basic level, that all students with the school going age should be given this opportunity of education. All citizens are to have this kind of education. That's why there's quite a notable effort, government effort to expand education infrastructure, from building and other infrastructures from primary to secondary education, to ensure that all graduates in primary school are all absorbed into secondary education, at least to ensure that we provide education, minimum level of education to all students in Tanzania will now be Form 4 education. This is the area where we expect them to meet global, and therefore they're going to be exposed to some concepts and therefore become active citizens in the social, political, and economic endeavors. Okay, now the condition for implementing this this approach of planning, first is that you should have accurate data projections. Data is everything in the planning process. Of course, we discussed in the earlier classes, data is very much important in all process. But for the case of social demand approach, data projection is very important, because we have to know to project data, demographic data, in terms of spatial population growth, population growth rate, talk about population density, we talk about population issues like fertility, etc. So you need to have demographic information of the population through which you want to plan for social demand approach. Second is you have to know student growth rate within the educational system, how cohort are enrolled and move within the educational system, because it's very important. How many enroll, how many graduate, is very important to know the growth rate within the education system. At least you have also to compare in the past 5 years, what was the population of the student in the education system, and now that gives you understanding of planning for the future. Then you need to know teacher requirement projection, because when you expand education infrastructure, when you expand the threshold for students to enroll, then their other requirement also will be increased, and therefore student requirement is very important to know. You have to also to plan for, to consider issues like infrastructure projection, talk about technological and others. You have to consider education cost being constant. You have to assume that it is constant, because changes in educational cost will definitely hamper any projection or planning for compulsory education for all. Because as being social services, which is competing with the other resources, is competing with the resources, but with the other social services, it's expected that education must suffer. You can end up having many graduates with no qualification who are half cooked, and therefore will not be useful in all aspects of life, social, political, and economic. Then you need to also understand the demand for education will always be continuing growing, and therefore supply for it must be anticipate this demand, because as population increase, then demand for education also will increase. These are the things or conditions of which must be met if you plan for social demand approach. Remember that education and social services is not one and only one social services. We have security, water, health, etc., etc. All of them, they compete in one cake, national cake, and therefore, since they depend on national budget mostly for financing of education, though in the current education policy, it is also calling for collaboration with the private sector and the other partners. But mostly because it is a public service, then the government, the first giant who are to ensure that education is provided to the system, to our citizens. Therefore, because we have only one national cake, then it is divisible among other subsectors of which education is one among. Therefore, the issue of considering how population grow in the education system will also have to consider the capacity of the government itself. Normally, in social service provision, we are wallowing or we are struggling about three bottlenecks. We have the so-called cost of providing service. We have quality we want to achieve, and then we have cost, quality, and the so-called access. Okay, or in other words, say quantity. Okay, quantity. Okay, so all these three must be balanced to meet somewhere, because if you rely on one, you suffer, likely to suffer. For example, the more you expand VEG for inclusivity, that all with the schooling age should be in school, this means that the school population will increase, and therefore it will need more investment, it will need more input will raise, input will raise up, and therefore if input raise up, because we are competing in other areas, it's likely that we can compromise quality if we cannot meet the increasing input relative to the increasing population in the education system. And therefore end up that we have many students in the education system, but actually they are going to school, but they are not learning. And therefore this is the outcry globally, that our students are in school, they're going to school, but they're not learning, simply because sometimes resources are very meager to meet the increasing pace of students within the school system. So it is very, very important that you need to balance between the iron, it's called the iron triangle. How you break this triangle, because there's no way you will provide education to citizens without with cost free. It's not possible. Then because we are also fighting to raise quality require more investment. Therefore, the more investment you need to improve quality is in terms of cost. Therefore, it must either implicate or suffer the who benefit because of the available resources. So to balance these three, cost, quality, and the access, it needs planners to be very analytical and the thinkers to ensure that available small budget of education is used to meet these needs. And therefore, let's move to advantage of demand approach. This kind of planning is very much advantageous, and that's why mostly our countries and most developing countries, they adopt this one because it also have political as well as social advantages. One, the approach encourages mass education, which of course is a cry. Ever since our countries gained independence, we are fighting to ensure that the majority should be educated. I talked in one of our classes that a country with a higher population, but with the low literacy or low level of education, is a caste country. But a country with the higher population with higher level or literacy level, this one is blessed, because when it comes to resource utilization, it is an advantage as compared to this one. This one will combine those. That's why I find we are compromising the natural resources and the environments, because our population, the larger part of population, they have no that quality education which can be user friendly to the environment. Therefore, one of the advantages is that it encourages mass education and the mass literacy, which is very needed in our economy, provided that we can be able to handle it. Second, it is easy to defend. Its philosophy is very simple. We talk about education is a human right, and therefore the approach is certification of education of the people. People need education, and therefore its philosophy is very simple. It's very easy to defend to the voters because they need education, and therefore if you say everyone will be to school, therefore it will be welcomed with the two hands because it's their desire. Thirdly, it is an instrument for building egalitarian society. We can build a loyalty and a society of equality if we implement this one, because one of the agent which is dividing the population is education. Okay, because education is tied to income earning. Okay, so those population, those with the education are likely to have higher income because they have opportunities, access to opportunities as compared to those who are not educated. Remember when we are discussing the concept of human capital theory, and the productivity exclusively. I find that therefore, if we can offer education to all citizens equally, then we are building egalitarian society. Okay, it can show another advantage. It can show the planner the resources that can be allocated to each level of education, as long as certain existing trends continue and if private demand is not to be satisfied. In other words, when you are planning for education system complies of some subsectors. We have primary education, we have secondary education, we have college education, we call higher education, or post-secondary education. Then we have tertiary education. All these subsectors, they communicate the same. It should be holistic. They communicate the same, and therefore, okay, planners will need to know which sector need what, and therefore it's easy to allocate resources. Another advantage of social demand approach, it democratizes education opportunities in the society. It gives democracy to education opportunities because, for example, in TZ, now we're talking about the basic education for all as of Form 4. This Form 4 is a hub. Form 4 is a hub to learning avenue. Okay, while primary is the foundation of our education. Primary is the foundation of our education. The secondary education is the hub because it's the point of departure. When you have secondary education, it's when you can desire to go, you want to go to vet at some considerable higher level, you want to go to college education, university education, other training, etc. It's Form 4. It's mostly the minimum requirements in most of the post-secondary education stages. Therefore, when you have this level of education and it's provided free, it's likely that you increase opportunities of learning to the society, and that is also the base for lifelong learning. It promotes a sense of national unity and equality because of this equalized educational opportunity. Okay, disadvantage or limitations of the same is that first, it requires sufficient number of qualified teachers to match student-teacher ratio. Okay, because if you don't have sufficient qualified teachers, then many students in the education system will end up graduating half-cooked. Teachers are very important ingredient on, if we say, education recipe. Then teachers is very important ingredient to ensure that we produce qualified graduates. Therefore, it requires sufficient number of teachers. And to talk about this one, we talk about expanding and improving teacher education. It's very important. Very important. Second, it is too expensive to implement, because if you talk about per unit cost of a student, both direct and indirect cost is very much raised. It's raised up. It's too expensive, because education is social services. Sometimes it will require a huge investment to ensure that population with the school-going age with the qualification to join the education system, they are in the pipeline. So it's very expensive to implement because of the per unit cost raise. It depends per number of the population. It may lead to economic stagnations or decline. If investment in the country is that much good to cope with the pace of population growth, it will stagnate the economy, because most of the expenditure will be levied to educational provision, and therefore it will be biting, and mostly because it's investment in nature. Most of it is consumption in nature. Education is consumption in nature. Therefore, most of the expenditures in education will be sunk cost, and it has direct, immediate impact on the investment, and therefore economic growth will be stagnant if there are no other investment activities going in the country, and because we sometimes also depend on donors and soft loans, it will also raise the debt. Debt will raise. Okay, we borrow from international bodies, international organizations, soft loans with the lower conditions, but loan is loan. Sometimes you have to pay with increasing interest, so it will increase, because we want to subsidize education to ensure that it can afford. Subsidizing will need using of money, national money, expecting that taxpayers will pay the same. For example, the fee-free education from pre-primary to lower secondary, this require government substitution. Okay, subsidizing. Mostly government have to provide finance in education system to ensure that buildings are there, internet are there, electricity are there. In other words, the infrastructure should be expanded to accommodate all students, but in the expenses of the taxpayer, through the borrowed burdens and the borrowed debts, and therefore you avoid the direct cost of parents, but the indirect cost is increasing in the same pace. It is very important to note this one. Another limitation is that the approach has no control of factors such as the price of education. It's fair to consider such factor change education, because education is investment long term. You can think of providing education for all today, but in 5 years to come, fluctuation in economy will let you know that this is the burden which you cannot bear. We have seen in the history of Tanzania, for example, immediately after independence, there was a need to have a high number of educated citizens. Subsectors like primary education were liberated, were given free, without fee-free. But later, sometimes after the SPA, after the changes in economics in the early 1980s, structural adjustment forced some countries to introduce fee in educational services through what we call liberal markets, and therefore you find that sometimes it can be of short term. In the long term, it's something which cannot be afforded. Another thing to consider that limitation is the approach has no control over absorptive capacity of economy for trained personnel. Okay, the graduates, when it comes to the economy, sometimes it becomes overcrowding, and therefore increasing the problem of educated unemployed, which is now a big problem to most of African states or developing countries. Lastly, to discuss, the approach does not in any way lay claim to whether the resources expended are economically allocated, and therefore is poor because there's no surety of the return in what you're investing. You meet one part of advantage, but the rest cannot be assured. Okay, the others we can discuss in your own, but we have the approach does not provide guidance we need so as to how best to meet the identified needs, because you're just providing education, but you don't have the identified needs. It's just everyone should have education, but which kind of education is questionable. Approach has to match to education budget, as I've discussed. Does not consider absorptive capacity of economy. This one is repeated, and therefore it's usually very difficult to measure. It's not easy to measure the benefit which is coming from that education, especially when you make it compulsory. Okay, it's not in the operational. It's very important to note. Okay, let's move a little bit. Second one is the so-called human resources development approach. This one is focusing on developing human resources, HR, human resources. We have discussed this concept when we were discussing issues of human capital theory, that educated human being is a resource by himself or by herself, because in the production process he or she has a contribution to make, and this is primary because you can have good personal resources without having educated human being. Those cannot be transformed into proper production. So what is this? Human resources development approach is a system approach that relates manpower and educational planning to national development, which encompasses economic, cultural, social, and political development in building a national identity and integrity. There's a confusion sometimes with a manpower approach with HR. HR also contribute manpower, because manpower talk about skilled manpower. Okay, skilled. But focusing entirely on the human resources development approach, it is focused on a broader range of factors involved in human resources development rather than on a simple head count in skilled professional work categories. In other words, you consider economic at large of the country, and then you need to know the human resources which is required to work in the economic or social or political sector. This one is not futuristic per se, because it's like you want to respond the gap and the demand on the subsectors of the production subsectors. Okay, so to meet the country's needs for human resources, educational planner must give definite answers to the following questions. Okay, they have to answer these questions. In other words, these are the guiding questions when you are planning for human resources. What educational level will be emphasized, primary, secondary, or higher education? For example, under decentralization, in local government, there are some officials which are needed, for say, ward education officers. We talk about ward executive officers, watendaji. We talk about villages and the mitaa executive officers. There are some skills which are needed to fill gaps within production process in the entire state. Therefore, there must be one question: is what level will be emphasized? Do we need to have more primary graduate, secondary graduate, higher education graduate? What is the focus by now? And by the way, these two are combined in TZD under the current policy. It's under one cluster. Second, should the number or education quality determine the educational system orientation? Are we focusing on number of graduates or quality of graduates? Okay, this is a question of skilled, semi-skilled, and skilled, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled. Because in economic sense, or in economy, all are needed, but with the differing proportionality. For example, you talk about engineers. They are expert of high level. When they go to site, they don't fix the blocks on the wall, but they have a design. They will have site managers. They will have foreman. they will have those actual people who are working with the construction. So all this should be available in place. And the planning for HR, you have to know this, and therefore think of whether you need numbers or quality. Then what subject area should be given focus? Okay, science, technology, liberal arts, etc. For example, now the focus is vocational education. Vocational education. Elimu Amali in Tanzania. For this is the song everywhere. It's prevalent everywhere. Now, to achieve this vocational education, vocational training education, you need a graduate education system with at least a good skills and basic training in mathematics, science, technology, and innovation. And therefore, that's what there's emphasis on STEM. Okay, STEM is very much emphasized. Sometimes some STEM. Okay, science, technology. Okay, mathematics, innovation. All this will form a base. So if once they have this basic training, then it's likely to you can have engineers, scientists, etc. because you have the base. Therefore, when you plan, you have to think of all this. Others, should formal education take precedence of an informal? What should be the focus? We have formal, informal, and then informal. These are the divisions or categories to which you have to understand education when you talk about the entire education system. It have to consider of all these: formal, informal, and non-formal. Which should be the focus? If you focus with the formal, you have adult which need some skills, some training, which will be accommodated under non-formal. But there's this home, family, other institutions which also are part of the training. They also implement curriculum. You have to think of these areas. Then, how are human resources moved in the direction? It is very important. The movement of resources in the economy is very, very much important. Advantage. First, it focuses on holistic human development because there is emphasis on overall development of individuals' knowledge, skills, value, and attitude, rather than narrow thing to speak to the market. You don't think of the market. We are developing the human resources in our sectors. Therefore, we consider on holistic development of individuals. Curriculum would focus on that area. It promotes lifelong learning, okay, because it recognizes education as a continuous process, and therefore will encourage beyond formal schooling to enhance adaptability, personal growth across the lifespan. Also, for the case of growing HR to grow. Then the support of social and national development goals, because in the national development goals, we talk about the sector-wide performance, HR is part and parcel. They are the blood in most of the organization, and therefore understanding the requirement of each sector is very important, and therefore it will support social and national development, because you align education with the broader social, cultural, and economic development objectives, not only immediate employment but in the future. Depends on the subsector and the production process. It enhances individual productivity and innovation because you are training people specific to the needs of the economy. Investing in broader-based educational and skills, you are focusing on what is required in specific production sectors. It recognizes education as an investment, and also the risk of skill mismatch. You don't produce graduates with skill mismatch. You exactly produce according to the skill needed in sectors of production. Also, the issue of equity and inclusiveness can be taken care because of human resources approach to planning. Another, I talked about advantages and disadvantages of human resources management, human resources approach in planning, and we have already covered all this. Now let's discuss the manpower requirement approach in educational planning. Manpower requirement approach in educational planning. Under manpower requirement planning, this one is like mostly it's like the human resources approach. There's a confusion somewhere, there's an overlap of the concept, but however these two terms are different. Human resources, as I've said, is concerned with the human resources required in production other But one of the weaknesses that it does not think of other informal sectors, for example. With manpower requirement approach, the term manpower requirement approach implies that the use of statistical input from economic sources is required in order to establish present and future needs of the manpower by educational and occupational categories. In other words, you study a performance of economy today, time one, and then you project it for performance of economy in time in the future. It's very important, and therefore data is everything. It is everything, and that's why data is then compared with the output expected from the supply of manpower to the labor market. This concept of labor market is quite wider. We're talking about employment by all sectors, public and the private, but also there is self-employment of recruit themselves. So according to Mabere, the difference either a surplus will inform a need to cut back on education on training in a selected subject, or the efficiency will require further investment in relevant areas of manpower development. You study the economy entirely, all sectors, private, public, plus new ventures in economy, which will need some kind of knowledge and the skills to tap the potentials. Now, stages to plan for manpower requirement or manpower approach. You apply this approach when the following questions are answered. First, how many jobs will be vacant in the economy by the end of the target year? You are talking of expanding of the economy. What are the likely opportunities to be created and which will need manpower? What kind of skill will be required in the economy by the end of the target year? How many students are required in the education system in order to produce the required number of students to fill the vacancies by the end of the target year? So you're talking of the manpower requirement in the economy. This, in other words, list down the number of workers by sector or industry, education and occupational class for the base year. Then you project the size of the total number of force required by the end of target year. This can be determined by population projection based on gender, age, and the population in order to determine participation rate within the labor market. This concept is very important. We're not talking about employment alone. No, the employment in the sense of public sector, no. Talk about employment even in other non-public sectors. Advantage of this approach is that it requires an important guidance on the evolution of the educational qualification of the labor force based on what you are forecasting when you're looking for the future. It aims at self-sufficiency in manpower resources because we plan the whole country and not a particular region, but also it enables educational planners to examine the gaps and imbalances in educational output pattern against the available jobs in the labor market. The curricular developers must be aware of the labor market. They have to study the labor market of the country, and therefore when they develop curricula, it should address the shortage in the labor market. Those including those which require self-employment, those which require employment, in public and the private sectors. It also enables planners to evaluate whether and how the education system is meeting the requirements or as envisioned, but also the approach offers useful guidance on required changes needed in the education system. So this one will inform the education system in terms of curricula. We talk about provision, education delivery, and output. We need to define the output of the student. Talk about what will graduates do after their graduation when they join the society. It's very important that you make a comprehensive mapping of the labor demand in the market for your planning to be actual. Disadvantage of this one is tend to convert itself to the high level manpower needed in the modern sector economy, and therefore it ignores other subsectors like it ignores others like unskilled and semi-skilled. They have said the economy require or need all these unskilled, skilled, and the skilled one, because there is interdependence when it comes to operation. It tends to limit education to strictly producing manpower while ignoring optimum resources allocation, cost benefit analysis, and the social perspective of education. It ignores the consideration of cost involved or the capacity of their country to finance its labor development, but also the approach rely on existing labor market rather than on the optimum use of available human resources. Sometimes you can produce and the others will be jobless. Therefore, sometimes what you expect to be in the future will not be the reality, and therefore it also adds the problem of graduate unemployed if it was not very much mapped as per curriculum which was being implemented. The approach relies on borrowed employment classification on the developing country or western countries, ignoring the reality of the homeland countries. Also, the approach emphasizes initial training for employment and gives limited attention to continuous learning, reskilling, and adult education. It's very much focused on the so-called pre-service, ignoring the in-service and the adult counterpart. Okay, learners' interests, talents, and the personal development are also ignored. Personal preferences is also ignored. And this we talk about it ignores the so-called lifelong learning. It ignores lifelong, but here personal preferences are also ignored. But effective implementation requires extensive, reliable labor market data, which sometimes difficult in developing countries. We are very much incompetent when it comes to data. Though nowadays there's improvement. Most of the sectors have established their EMS, education management system, which sometimes will provide basic data and in particular sectors. As another approach for planning, the so-called cost-effective approach. This kind of approach was called cost-effective analysis. This one taken into consideration. So, cost-effective approach or cost-effective analysis. In this approach, both cash and education outcomes are explicitly considered. Costs normally expressed in shillings or dollars. Outcomes are expressed in relevant educational units to cover graduates, employment, lifespan, etc. At least two alternatives are compared, and then you opt for cheap but effective one. And normally it will involve a kind of some calculations which will be dealing with the marginality, the marginal or the additional increase by additional investment in education. In other words, cost effectiveness is a tool that may be used to educational plans to compare the cost and effectiveness of two or more program alternatives with similar objectives. objectives. For example, we are talking nowadays of expanding access to education. We talk about all students of school going age should be in school from pre-primary to lower secondary education. This commitment is very promising, but the objective is that free basic education should be provided to all students with the school going age at this particular age from 2015 when there was a rollout of this policy. Now the issue is, so the objective is that to ensure all students with school going age are in school and are participating learning. Now we want to compare cost and effectiveness of the program. Now, one is this objective by itself has got several implications. Implication number one, we have to expand school buildings. It's either we expand primary school to be large enough to accommodate both primary and O level. Second is to ensure that proximate secondary school are expanded so that they can absorb all graduates from ward who are joining the ward secondary school. We have ward secondary school, every secondary school. Every ward has got secondary school. Some of the wards have got secondary 2 to 3 secondary school, shule za kata. Now, if we want all primary school to be absorbed in one secondary school, means that the secondary school now should be expanded enough to absorb all primary leavers. So there is either expanding primary education, primary schools infrastructure to include lower secondary school, or expanding the ward secondary school to absorb all primary school graduates. All these are alternatives, and each of them has got implications. If secondary school is expanded, there's implication on leadership. If every primary is expanded, there's implication in leadership cost as well, because we're talking of mixing students of different categories of age and maturity. But again, you can decide that because all school enrollment will expand because of the number of students being forced to join the school system, but also to graduate without failure, then the possibility could be, we can, instead of expanding this primary school to lower secondary school can be instead run in 2 sessions, morning session and evening session. Therefore, same school which could accommodate 1,000 students mean that in the morning 5 will attend, in the afternoon 5 will attend. Therefore, same infrastructure, same buildings, you have almost 1,000 school. But either you can decide to expand the infrastructure to accommodate this school. In each of the sections you made, there's consequences, there's cost which must be incurred. That is the essence of cost-effective analysis. Mean that you have the same objective, but you want to take the least cost alternative and implement. That becomes the meaning of cost-effective. You meet the objective by adopting alternative which is lower cost than the other. Okay, we want to ensure that students, another second example, students should get meal to continue with their studies in every day. It's either parents should contribute food in school and then organize the program of providing meal, or we break for them to go back and take their meal at the home and they come back to school. Each alternative has got expenses and they have to decide. There are so many ways of which you can present objective differently. So cost-effective analysis require both detailed accounting of cost of each alternative and the common outcome that may be compared across the alternative under consideration. The product of cost-effectiveness study is the cost-effectiveness ratio for each alternative. For example, we talk about, let's say increasing the current expenditure. Take a successful secondary school. The current status of, let's say it is worth $100 to learn normal secondary school X. This includes cost of paying bills, electrical, utilities, cost of paying salaries for number of teachers available, staff available. If you want to expand access for students, let's say this one was accommodating maybe 5 students. Now I want it to increase to 1,000 students. Then it's likely that it will increase the buildings, and therefore it will take, let's say, secondary school X, after expanding, let's say it will take $500 US dollar. Okay. But you also, at the same expense, instead of expanding, we learn session in 2 programs, evening program and the morning program. Alternatively, we have to increase payment to teachers, same teachers. Utility will increase, at least it will take us to $3,100. Then we will compare between adding new buildings to accommodate 1,000 students, or going into sessions to accommodate 1,000 students with additional cost. Which one will pay? There are some calculations which you have to undergo. Okay, change in the cost over change in output. The ratio you get in episode 1, then change in the cost over change in outcome. Episode 2, a comparison will give you the choice. If this one is lower, you adopt. If this one is higher, you abandon. Vice versa is true. That's the essence of what we call cost-effective analysis. Let's say, by changing from implementing expanding buildings, it will take us the changes accrued from normal to increasing buildings, let's say, is 5. And changes will take from normal to 2 sessions, let's say it will take 3. Then this ratio will inform that this is better than this one. Then you opt second alternative, and that will be that it can be that all schools, all secondary school, should learn in 2 sessions, morning session and evening sessions, and to ensure that all those who are selected are joining the school system. So the cost effectiveness ratio tells us the cost per unit of improvement, such as 1 point increase in scale core for each alternative intervention, and that will be the guiding principle in your decision. Steps, as I've said, identify the viable alternatives, multiple intervention for improving the mental health score, can be example, or attendance, or enrollment. Second, two, locate reliable impact studies for each alternative that use same measure of effectiveness for each alternative, e.g. change in score on specific math assessment, etc. Step 3, estimate the cost for each alternative. Step 4, calculate the cost-effective ratio of each alternative. And 5, you select the appropriate, which is most minimal, and then you implement. I've taken this example of expanding access, which will be very simple to understand than even taking this one of the program of increasing performance in a subject, particular subject X. Talk about whether we have remedial or we increase hours of teaching. Another one is the so-called cost-benefit rate of return analysis. Cost-benefit and the rate of return analysis. Cost-benefit and the rate of return analysis. Unlike cost-effective analysis, cost-benefit analysis is wider. This one compare economic values of initiatives and therefore help the policymakers to make a decision by allocating proper resources. The same values in dollars, but we want to have actual cost of production. For example, we want to reduce dropout, and the alternative we have to do, there must be turned into the so-called cost per unit. We can ask the question, how many values of shillings will be required to reduce dropout of students per year? And then we can compare whether that one, by returning them to school, what are the benefits which we get. Cost analysis in general measure the system resource input, compare the benefit, efficacy, utility, and also system performance through its alternatives which are planned in place. Cost benefits in this context, cost benefit analysis, sometimes also called benefit cost analysis, is a systematic approach to estimating the strength and the weakness of alternative. We want to say, let's say, cost benefit. What is the benefit of forcing every person with schooling age to be in school? What is the benefit? Because ensuring that everyone is in school, it will require some cost. But what is the benefit of them attending to school? We talk about private benefit. We talk about social benefit. Sometimes called spillover benefit, etc. Okay. By an individual, we talk about economic benefit. By an individual being educated or undergoing educational process, being educated, personally, there's a gain, there's advantage. We have seen under the so-called human capital theory. But to the society, there's also benefit, the spillover, when it comes to political activation, when it comes to environmental protection, when it comes to sharing advice, when it comes to hygiene matters, when it comes to health protection. As one is educated, he likely to prevent escalation of some of the unrequired issues in the society. So we believe that there is a benefit a person will gain in education, but also there is a benefit society will gain from one being educated, and there is also a benefit totally for personal and the society for education being provided in the society. It is very, very important. It is used to determine options which provide the best approach to achieving benefit while preserving savings and for transaction activities and functional business requirement. Cost-benefit analysis may be used to compare completed or potential causes of action and to estimate or evaluate the value against the cost of decision, projection, or policy. It is commonly used to evaluate business or policy decision, particularly public policy, commercial transaction, and project. For the public policy, as I've said, what is the advantage of all students being educated at least from 4 level? There must be advantage. One, we are focusing on improving peace in the state. We are focusing on improving environmental interaction. We are focusing on reducing illiteracy, function into the literacy, etc. Of which, if one acquire, he become active and the participant and the active participation in the political, social, and economic activities in the country. So there are the benefit, whether he's employed or not employed, whether she's employed or not employed, but there are some indirect benefit we gain by educating the population. Okay, cost benefit analysis is often used by the organization to apply the desirability of given policy. It is an analysis of the expected balance of benefit and the cost, including an account of any alternative and the status quo. Should we give education by fee paying or fee free as it is now? And what is the benefit of each one? That's the question of cost benefit analysis. Okay, this is the advantage. Generally, key cost benefit analysis has the following steps. As I've said, you define the goal and objective of the action, list alternative action, list stakeholders, select measurements, predict outcomes, convert all cost into common currency, apply discount rate, what is the net present value of action and consideration, perform sensitivity analysis, adopt the recommended course of action. Of course, this one, they are in the introduction part. As you go higher in your studies, you can understand more of how they are applied. But generically, these are steps you have to follow. That is about understanding the net present value of what you are doing now. It's an education is investment. So whatever you invest now should give return. That's the essence. You are taking children to school. You are educating your children. What will be the benefit in return? That's the essence of this cost benefit. You are investing in education. What is the benefit? What will you return? Will get in return? That's the essence of cost benefit. We want to see how the investment in education pays to the country, but to individuals within the economy. This is an example of cost benefit analysis which try to show return from investing in education. It's worldwide education spending. According to Jimenez and the Patros, this here you can go and look at this Economics of Education. It's a book which tells more about investment in education. So it shows the investment in education, how it is rising as per GDP, gross domestic product. As from 1970s, this is the era of industrial revolution, back to the 2000s and south, 2000 years, you find there's then a considerable increase in spending in education, and it was very much notable around 1980s. So there was the era of economic boom. There was economic boom here, and therefore we find that spending education was also higher. But what is the possible benefit? We see that studies inform that the higher someone goes in education up, the higher it's likely to benefit from education. If you compare the cost of education to the benefit one accrue, you find that benefit is greater than cost when you come to university level education. And if you compare at the secondary level, I mean, primary is more or less, it's very less compared to others. And therefore, this is direct cost versus earning. Earning is higher than than spending, and as one acquire higher education, the more likely to benefit. Therefore, we have to invest in, we should invest in education if we really want to improve performance of the economy. Advantages of cost benefit analysis and the rate of return. I will very much rush on this because I want you to have time on discussion on the theme. First, it improves decision making by providing critical information. If you know that something's worth paying, you also will invest more on that particular account. Second, it enhances understanding of project goals and how they relate to one another. Okay, and also it helps compare information, increase chances of success, improve project planning. Once you know what will be in the future, or the project will tend to accrue in the future, it also have repercussions or some implications on enhanced understanding on the projection, but also how you can compare information past and the future, and also it will increase the chance of success because you know future is worth paying, and then you can improve the project of you are doing. So if it's education, because you think it pays you more, you will invest more to ensure that you maximize your earning. Challenges, we have problem of data, and therefore it's difficult in evaluating intangible benefits. Some benefit in education cannot be calculated in terms of money. For example, civic values, issues like peace building, because of education. How do you quantify social cohesion? Also has got advantage in a community life. How do you quantify social cohesion? Personal development. Some of the things cannot be converted in monetary terms, and therefore difficult to quantify. Another is the limitation of data and reliability of issues. Accurate data and on cost somehow difficult to get, and therefore it's difficult to establish a clear path of whether this one is very much useful. Another is that isolating the effect of education from other factors influencing earnings also a problem. We have issues like talents, okay, and the gifts. Okay, some people they are fluent, but they have no education at all. So linking education to gain and the success entirely is quite sometimes wrong. There's also some other factors which can be attributed to one's education to improve with the earning. Another is time lag between the cost and the benefit. There's a time between what you invest and when you reap, and therefore sometimes difficult, long time from when you graduate to time when you start getting income. Sometimes it becomes difficult to quantify the gaining from education. But also there's a problem of just of discount. We talk about net present value. How can the present predict the future? It's another problem with this. Another issue to consider that this one is very advanced technique. It requires expertise, of which can be a problem in our local government system. Okay, assumption of competitive labor market is another something which is plausible. Measurement of opportunity cost. Okay, there are things which you sacrifice in order to get what you get. You undergoing to school from primary to university. You have a lot of to sacrifice. If you compare, ability to compare the gain between what we have sacrificed and what you are getting now is quite difficult, and therefore difficult to judge whether this one is better than the other. There's also a problem of ignoring quality difference in education. We are educated in different areas and backgrounds. We have dual education system. Talk about shule za kifagio and that without kifagio. Talk about medium, English medium, and those going to Kayumba schools. There's dual system of education. So one will undergo education with very higher quality, others with the medium, and others with mediocre. How do we compare the same when it comes to production? It's quite difficult to quantify. There's also static and historical bias, relying on past earning to reflect the future is sometimes not real. So these are some of the challenges of cost benefit analysis to apply in education. As I finish up my lecture, let us discuss a little bit on the general factors which affect effective educational planning. Based on all we have discussed, the 5 approaches to educational planning, these are the factors which overall affect every planning approach one will adopt and implement. First is administrative bottlenecks. Sometimes administrators pose difficulties on their planning process. They cannot give appropriate cooperation, or sometimes they don't devise the planning on time, and therefore sometimes it poses limitations on the issues of planning by employing expertise. There is lack of adequate demographic data. It's another problem. Sometimes we don't have accurate data. Therefore, if we make a projection, which will end up giving us inaccurate in the planning process. There's inadequate resources. Okay, we can have a very good plan when it comes to implementation, like social demand approach. But when it comes to implementation, resources will be the first enemy to let us down. Also, political instability. There's political upheavals everywhere, mostly in the developed countries. After immediate, before and after election, and there are so many political instabilities sometimes, and also a change in the political figures. Every political leader, especially in the presidential level, they will come up with their own with their own priorities, which sometimes will frustrate the previous educational planning, and therefore it's not continuous because of that nature. But also there's waste imbalance within the educational system. Okay, there's no clear match between primary graduate, secondary graduate, and university graduate. Sometimes one of the sector might be producing more than the other, and therefore mostly we don't achieve the goal because there's no uniformity on the graduation from one level to another. Therefore, there's a waste of imbalance within the education system. There's the financial constraint. Finance as another resource poses limitations in the educational planning. There's also rising demand to education because of population growth, population growth, which is not equal to growing rate of economy. Okay, our economy grow at low rate as compared to population. Therefore, demand is higher than the supply. It's another problem in the planning of it. Another, youth population explosion is another area, because youth come with their own priorities, their own demand. Therefore, we fail to capture this explosion to education planning properly. Okay, then we have manpower imbalance. Okay, like what I've said, sometimes we produce more of product X in education and the less of product Y in the same economy, and therefore we find that though there's a graduation in every year, it comes to labor market, some of the sectors they suffer to get HR with the qualification. Others, they are surplus. It's because of manpower imbalance. Then there's cultural factors. Okay, sometimes you plan for case of equality and equity. It's a problem. Okay, some of the culture prohibit or limit girls from accessing education, and therefore there's gender parity within the education system. And lastly, there's a lack of planning expertise. For example, cost benefit analysis, cost effective analysis, cost efficiency. All this require expertise in the economy, and therefore sometimes it's difficult to get them in sufficient number, and this becomes a problem in the effective planning in education. All in all, we assume that with time, and that's why some of you are engaging in these studies, we expect to become professional educational planners in the future. Having said that, I appreciate your attention with this long lecture, expecting that you take more time reading, more time listening, discussing, evaluating, analyzing, and then when we meet, we can have at least face-to-face discussion, or through the chat room, or the live streaming chatting. Okay, have some comments of which you can address to make comprehensive of what have been discussed. Thank you very much, and thank you for taking your time.